Hello there, John Guturillo here, the counsellor of your listener. Thank you very much for joining me for today's episode. Before we begin, I'd like to wish everybody a very happy new year. I hope that everyone had a wonderful holiday season and was able to spend time with the people they love, doing what they enjoy doing. And for those who may not have had such an easy season, because I know that this time of year can be difficult for those of us in dire situations, I hope you have the support you need, and remember that there is support available if you need it. As I reach the first anniversary of the Your Listener podcast, I'd also like to thank everyone who has supported me across time, people who have listened to the program and who have supported it, people who have collaborated with me and provided excellent insight into the topics that we've discussed, and also all my wonderful clients who have given me the privilege of entering into their lives and helping them achieve their goals. To be genuine, it's not the easiest job in the world, but that's not why I entered it. I entered it because I consider it an incredible privilege to be able to help people achieve their goals and overcome their challenges, and I see great meaning in it every day that I perform my role. So thank you to everybody who has supported me in that way and given me this wonderful privilege. Today's episode is going to be discussing extreme beliefs and how extreme beliefs may develop and some of the dynamics of them. Now, before we begin, as per usual, nothing that you hear in today's episode is advice in any way. If you have concerns about anything, please seek professional guidance. I'm not going to be labeling anyone or denigrating anybody. This is not to say that if you have certain beliefs as opposed to other beliefs that you are a bad person. This is a discussion of ideas to educate on how the mind works so that we can become more critical thinkers, better consumers of information, and ultimately live our lives more effectively if you so choose to. Now, extremist beliefs have always existed in history, and we could best describe extremist beliefs as the result of taking ideas that may have merit in their own right and then exaggerating or distorting them to the extent that they lose their practicality because of the sheer destructive nature of them, the sheer potential of them to cause harm when applied in a practical sense. And often this is described in terms of political beliefs. For example, fascism is an extreme right-wing belief and communism is an extreme left-wing belief. Nowadays, though, because we have technology, extreme beliefs have more freedom to proliferate. The problem with them are that most of them are empty. They don't explain the causes of the problems that they purport to solve. They don't do much in the way of explaining human nature. They are just based on people's feelings, and often those feelings have some complexities, which I'll discuss shortly. The less substance they have and the more rhetorical they are, that is to say, the more they're designed to simply persuade rather than actually be a practical solution to a practical problem. It seems that the more people tend to believe it and the more popular they become in their given domains. This very much speaks to how the mind works. It tends to become more attached to ideas which speak to our emotions, those that tend to our emotional needs and confirm what we want to believe because those beliefs make us feel comfortable and bring us pleasure rather than actually telling us what we need to hear, what's practically true about life. Now, extremism leads to incredibly evil consequences, and yet people have argued and continue to argue that when a person exhibits extreme beliefs, rather than being evil themselves, they're actually misguided, that they've been misled into believing that certain ideas are true and that they shouldn't be labelled as bad because they don't know any better. Now, that is an entirely different discussion for another day, but the concept of being misguided is central here. Let's discuss briefly a traditional view on how an extreme belief may develop, similar to how any belief may develop except with a particular manifestation. If we use evolutionary theory to explain this, our minds are designed to attend to emotionally salient stimuli, that is to say, any phenomenon or event or information in the environment that stimulates our feelings, that produces a visceral reaction in our body and our mind. We could explain using evolutionary theory that when we have an extreme emotional reaction to something, it's actually our body's way of signaling that we should pay attention to it because it may, from an evolutionary standpoint, be important for us to be aware of it. Now, in the early days of humanity, when we were constantly coping with and having to contend with threats in our environment, that explanation does make sense. It makes sense that nature essentially builds into our being a way for us to know when we should be afraid or otherwise extremely aware of something. So from that perspective, when we perceive something as threatening and we start to have an emotional reaction and we start to feel physiological arousal, it's actually our body doing what it's designed to do and our mind doing what it's designed to do. It's our mind telling us this is potentially a threat to you, you should take notice of it and do something about it so that it doesn't harm you. Now, the caveat to that is, if we don't know something, if we're not familiar with something foreign, for example, a person of a particular background or of a particular set of qualities, because we don't know that it's harmless, what we may then be led to do is assume it's harmful to avoid any surprises which could be harmful to us. And then from that point, we engage in what's called top-down processing, which means interpreting new information in a way that is biased by existing decisions that we've already made. So if we've decided that something foreign is dangerous, even if we don't know that for certain, we then tend to interpret all information about that phenomenon in a way that brings us to the same conclusion, that it's dangerous. Now, this is traditionally how we explain phenomena such as prejudice and bigotry. It comes from fear. If we don't know something, we will assume it's dangerous to avoid any situation in which we could allow it to harm us. Some people take this to an extreme, and they will not only convince themselves that something is dangerous, but then they will try to persuade other people and succeed in persuading other people that that same phenomenon is dangerous, and then use that fear to their benefit. They will essentially claim, that phenomenon is dangerous, that person, that group, that idea is dangerous, but if you just follow me, we'll stand up and we'll defend ourselves against that, without knowing for certain that there is actually any danger at all. Some people may well know that, but they know that they can make money off of people's fear, and that's why they continue to do what they do, to sell this fear to people. Now, whether you know something is dangerous or not, whether you're misguided or simply doing what you do on purpose and not caring whether it harms people or not, it's no excuse to behave badly. And if you cause harm to people, then you need to take responsibility for that, because no one is forcing you, just because you're scared of something, to cause harm. But we need to understand the source of extreme beliefs in order to combat them effectively. The problem with the human mind is that it doesn't tend to deal well with others' perspectives. There are certainly those of us who are quite empathic, but part of our being is what we call egocentrism, or the tendency to be more aware of our own perspectives and the information with which we're familiar than other people's. Now, egocentrism is natural, it's just the way we work, and most people can counteract it in quite a healthy fashion. But there is always the tendency for our mind to operate in a way that precludes us from properly analysing information that opposes our opinions, but making salient the information that confirms them. And often we are completely unaware of the ways in which we may be wrong about something, simply because our mind is deliberately processing something in a particular way, because from an evolutionary standpoint, it was designed to make quick decisions about ideas in order to allow us to live our lives. Essentially, all of the world's evils can be attributed to cognitive bias and the way that our brains are erroneous in the way that they process certain information. Most people, however, are not dangerous. Most people at their core are good. We're just all, in some ways, misguided. Everyone's misguided in some way, including me. And that's why I produce the Your Listener podcast, and why I'm always inviting people with different perspectives on, because that allows me to then test what I believe to be true against the beliefs of other people, because that is the best way for us to learn whether we're correct or whether we're potentially misguided. An interesting phenomenon here, though, is that when we actually discuss our ideas in a civil fashion and analyse them critically, we will often find that we agree more than we initially think. What does this say? It says that a lot of the divergence that we perceive between us is actually an illusion. Okay, it's invented by our minds, because our minds are always programmed to feel more secure and more aligned with those who are similar to us than those who are dissimilar to us. And the greater the dissimilarity between us, the more we tend to perceive a dissimilarity. However, the dissimilarities, even the largest dissimilarities between two people, often aren't as large as they perceive them in qualitative terms. So with effort, we can actually perceive that we're actually more similar than we are different. But let's explain how extremism can possibly develop. Let's take the analogy of thirst and water. If a person is thirsty, then they will only be thinking about water until they satisfy that thirst. Now, normally, when we properly hydrate ourselves, we'll only be thirsty every once in a while throughout the day, and usually we'll ensure that we have an adequate intake of water so that we don't become dehydrated. But what if we were to only satisfy our thirst and hydrate ourselves drastically less often than we're meant to? We're going to be thinking about water more often throughout the day, aren't we? So using this analogy, what I'm arguing here is that if a person has extreme beliefs, there's a chance that they develop because that person actually started with reasonable needs and those needs were left unmet. And so as the person lived their life without those needs being met, they were constantly shifting their focus to those needs. And as they were ruminating about those needs, they started to look for attributions. They started to look for explanations about why those needs were left unmet and why they were living in an environment in which those needs were allowed to be left unmet. And as we try to explain how the world works, we often make mistakes. We make attribution errors. We oversimplify situations and look for the simplest possible explanation. The problem is, the brain often takes the most salient information, the information that stands out to it, so to speak, to make those simple explanations. And often, as I said, the information that is most salient to us is the information that is most emotionally charged, which often isn't the most accurate or most valid. So, as we constantly think about why our needs have been unmet, the explanations which we usually create are based on emotional needs, our desire to find a quick answer and to be right, rather than information that is based on the complexities and the intricacies of how the world works. And so while a person may start with valid needs, as those needs are allowed to be left unmet, they may develop into extreme beliefs as the person tries to find an explanation for why the world works the way it does, why it allowed their needs to be unmet, and what they should potentially do about it. And this is why people often do have valid grievances with particular ideas, but these develop into unreasonable beliefs. It's quite possible for people to have valid grievances and try to handle them reasonably. For example, if they have a problem with a particular idea, and perhaps they perceive it as being caused by a particular group of people, they may try to approach that group of people and reasonably explain why they have a grievance and how they would like to live on good terms with those people but make a compromise so that the situation is fair for both parties. A good example of this is in politics. Okay, the media and politicians love to persuade us that we are enemies just because we have what are essentially relatively small differences in our political beliefs. But in reality, many of us may try to find common ground with people with different political beliefs, and then we may have valid reasons to disagree with people with different political beliefs, or at least disagree with the ideas themselves. As I have discussed, and I'm going to discuss into the future, all major established political viewpoints do have flaws. They do have logical flaws in their structure, but people may try to deal with them reasonably. If we were talking about running a country or running a small community, people with divergent beliefs may try to meet each other and discuss how both of their needs could be met without having to sacrifice the needs of the other people. The problem is, when each of these people don't enter into the transaction in good faith, and they only want to be right, and they only want to have their own needs met without considering other people's needs, then each of them is always going to see each other as a threat, because all they perceive is resistance, and the other person trying to take without giving. Also, a person may have had a number of particularly negative experiences with people of different beliefs. For example, if you live in a place where there are a large number of political protests undertaken by certain groups, and you as an innocent bystander walking the streets one day happen to have been assaulted either deliberately or by accident without having anything to do with those protests, then you may have a valid grievance against that particular group. You may say, I believe this group is unsafe because I've had experience. Those people have hurt me. Or, this is something that's perhaps quite common for people who have had trauma, to feel uncomfortable around people who have similar characteristics to the people who traumatise them. For example, women who have been raped may feel particularly uncomfortable around men if it was a man who raped them. Okay, now, again, there are reasons why people have those skepticisms, because our minds are designed to learn from our experiences and take steps to avoid us having similar negative encounters. The problem is when we fail to discern, which again is often not our fault because a lot of this processing happens at an unconscious level. When we fail to discern the difference between the particular type of person with whom we've had negative experience and the rest of the members of a group of which they happen to be a member, coincidentally, that don't share the same characteristics or the same tendencies. For example, not all men are rapists, or not all people who share a particular political viewpoint, maybe just one political viewpoint, are going to express it violently. And just because there's a group of protesters expressing their opinions violently, it doesn't mean that everybody who shares parts of those beliefs is necessarily going to want to express them violently. And so to direct blame at them wouldn't be reasonable because only a select number of them are actually engaging in the violence. But the fears of different groups, or even the skepticism or the discomfort with certain groups, even if the person is not acting on them out of hatred or out of fear, but rather simply being aware of the potential danger, it often comes from a valid place. It's our body trying to tell us, you've had a bad experience in this situation with this group, so be careful in the future. Now, again, the likelihood is that when you have an encounter with a person of a particular group, the likelihood is in most cases they don't represent their group, that most members of that same group are not harmful, but that particular person happens to be, and it's biased your opinion of that group. But what may start as a valid skepticism or a valid concern then festers into unreasonable extremism. Often what happens is a person, I would argue, perhaps tries to constantly have good relations with people from that same group, but they keep getting harmed by that same group. And so the person keeps receiving information that confirms their existing fear. And then they start to feel that their needs are not being met. And they say to themselves, I'm trying to exist safely in this world, but every time I try to have a civil interaction with somebody of a particular group or a particular idea, I keep getting harmed. So why should I constantly sacrifice my needs just to be nice to other people? It seems like everyone in this group or everyone who believes this idea is harmful, so I might as well just assume they're all bad so that I don't get hurt. They don't deserve my consideration. And then what tends to happen is there will be extremist groups that claim to share that same grievance. And often they speak to people who have had those grievances and state, if you've had this grievance with this particular group, join our group and we'll protect you. We recognise your grievance, we recognise that you've been harmed, and we recognise that this group is dangerous. We're going to help you avoid harm in the future. And then what happens, I'm arguing in this case, is even if a person joins an extremist group in order to have a sense of belonging and a sense of protection, they may start not believing all the other beliefs that that group has, but they may start to adopt those beliefs over time because of the way their mind works. The way the mind works is it tends to experience what's called cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is our tendency to want to align our behaviours with our beliefs and to make our beliefs consistent with one another and our behaviours consistent with one another. And so a person may well, at an unconscious level, start not sharing all the beliefs of a particular group, but share one particular grievance or one particular belief, and they may, over time, state, well, the group was right about this one grievance that I had, and I know that was right, so I might as well believe everything else. Because they were right about one idea, they must be right about everything else. Or they may start to bias their thinking so that over time, they start to view the world as influenced by all those other beliefs and start to realise, so to speak, well, now I realise all these beliefs must be true. And they're right about everything. And when the bias becomes that extreme, you tend to view the whole world through that bias, which means you are less likely to question the validity of your beliefs and you're less likely to want to interact with somebody else who has opposing beliefs. Because your mind is going to be set in its ways in considering everything to be right according to this new belief system. Another problem that then develops is when you believe that a whole system of belief is true, but then somebody from an opposing belief system has a valid grievance, you'll tend to dismiss it because you believe it's false, like everything else that you've heard from them in your mindset. And this is why political pundits or political journalists always attribute the problems that they perceive in society to people with the opposing political view, but they never speak about problems that could potentially be attributed in a valid sense to their side of the political spectrum. Now, I'll admit, I've met a lot of people in my life, and I have unfortunately had some undesirable experiences with people of particular characteristics. And I'll admit, I'm human. I do become bothered at times and say, when is the world going to become more civilized? Can I really trust anyone from those groups? But I realized a long time ago, just because people from a particular group do something, it doesn't mean that everyone from that group does it. All right? Often you're just unlucky. Often you've just met someone who happens to have made some undesirable choices in their behavior, but maybe they also have a valid grievance, and maybe that has unfortunately been distorted to the extent that they engage in ineffective or unhelpful behaviors. So maybe they've had a similar experience. The world is an incredibly complex place, and often the simplest explanation which our mind can concoct is not the correct one. To avoid this damage, we must be comfortable with nuance and ambiguity. We must be patient and willing to say to ourselves, I cannot know every person on earth. I cannot know every person from a particular group. I cannot possibly know the cause of every misfortune that I've had with other people in my life. So it's healthy to have boundaries when interacting with other people. But if we assume that every person of a particular group is always going to bring with them an undesirable experience, we become bigoted, we become prejudiced, and we ultimately become hateful. And there are plenty of people on both sides of the political argument, as a good example, whose ideas with which I disagree. But I understand perhaps those beliefs developed from a valid source. And I'm always willing to talk to those people, and I would like to talk to more of those people. I'd like to meet people with a wider variety of different beliefs, and I would love to sit down with them and say, I'm curious about how you came to these conclusions, and I'd like to ask you questions. And I'm always honest to say I may not agree with you, but what I'm doing here is not about trying to question your humanity. It's about trying to understand you as a person and how a person can come to these conclusions, because I will most certainly learn something from that. And I challenge other people to do the same. You might be surprised with what you learn. So thank you for joining me for today's episode. As per usual, if you have any concerns of any kind, please seek professional guidance. And if you are interested by what you hear on my program, I would love to hear from you. Please feel free to contact me if you would like to be a guest and perhaps bring with you an interesting new topic that we can discuss, or if you have a topic that you'd like to hear me discuss, I'd be glad to hear that as well. And until the next episode, take care.